Thanks for joining. We'll get started in just a minute to let some stragglers dial in, so sit tight. Thanks for joining. My name is Cassie Rowe, Content Marketing Specialist at 451 Research. Today's webinar, Data Center Services and Infrastructure 2019 Preview, will be presented by Dan Thompson and Kelly Morgan. Before we dive into the content, I just want to give a brief introduction to 451 Research for those who aren't familiar with us. 451 Research is a top-tier research and advisory firm headquartered in New York City. Our team of more than 100 analysts cover more than 2,000 technology vendors and service providers every year. 451 Research provides unique insight into emerging disruptive technologies and companies taking them to market and deliver that insight via syndicated research, advisory services, and live events around the world. Before I turn it over to today's presenters, just a few housekeeping items. The webinar slides will be available for download in the resource section of the On24 platform. There is also a link where you can download a complimentary excerpt of the 2019 Trends Preview Report associated with today's presentation. You can also submit questions to the presenters in the same platform for On24 at the end of this webinar, and the webinar recording will be available shortly after today's session. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Kelly and Dan.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everybody. So we'll be talking about the Data Center Services and Infrastructure channel, we call them here at 451, or team. And to start with, I'll just introduce the team, I guess, and talk about where we cover, which is the whole world. So I won't go into the specifics of which analyst covers which area, but suffice it to say we have 3 analysts based in Europe, covering Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, and Eastern Europe. We have 3 analysts covering Asia. We have 3 covering Latin America. We have 1 interconnection analyst and 5 U.S. analysts covering markets large and small, both the big markets and the emerging markets. So we'll jump into talking about some of the trends that we'll be looking at in our research going forward this year. That's part of what the preview document is all about. And so for this webinar, we'll certainly start by talking about the market overall. For multi-tenant data centers or leased data centers, we actually do include some single-tenant sites in here, but the ones that are leased from the bigger providers out there that kind of specialize in data centers. So this, at the moment, worldwide, is about a $38 billion market revenue-wise. Around 40% of that is in the U.S. at the moment, almost 40% in Asia, and we're expecting Asia to actually surpass North America in about 2021. We've got around 19% in EMEA and 5% in LATAM, with an expected 15% growth rate in Latin America. So it's due to grow quickly, even though it's from a relatively small base. We're also expecting, for example, Africa to grow quite a bit more quickly going forward. APAC, next up with a 12% growth rate, so lots happening there. Again, that's why the market will probably surpass the U.S. We've got about a 7% growth rate in North America, which, included in that, it varies enormously by city. So certain locations, such as Montreal, we're expecting almost 20% growth. But in several other larger markets, it's going to be quite a bit lower. So that's why we've got an average of about 7% and a 9% growth rate for EMEA. So, of course, classic next question, what is driving this growth? And we'll be looking at that as well as some of the broader trends in the industry. Some of those trends we won't discuss on this webinar, but they're in the preview report. So you can certainly download that and look at them afterwards. The key question is location, 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 right? Where this data center space will be needed. Where is it now? Where is it going to need to be? In addition to the growth country by country, we'll be looking, of course, at growth city by city. And there are some contradictory trends, so we'll talk about that in this webinar a bit. There are certainly at the moment, most of the data centers are in the large major cities. Northern Virginia is a little bit of an anomaly. We can have a whole extra webinar on that when we launch our next Northern Virginia report, because despite a relatively small population compared to, say, Tokyo or London or even Mexico City, it's got the largest data center market in the world. But certainly in most other locations, data centers have tended to be built kind of near large population centers. But that may change, or we may start to see data center space move into some of the kind of next level cities, or even some of the bigger cities that are currently lacking in space. So for example, some of the cities in Latin America have much less space than their population and GDP would suggest. So we'll see a lot more growth, and we'll certainly talk more about that. And one of those factors coming into play is this question of latency versus low cost and energy efficiency. So that leads to our cloud impact on data centers. One key trend we're working on, of course, is the impact of the cloud in general, and the build versus lease question for big cloud providers. This will keep shifting. People did used to expect that cloud providers would build all their own data centers and that leased data centers would go away, but we're actually not seeing that necessarily. So to start with, cloud providers continue to demand data center space. They are still moving workloads to the cloud. Enterprises are still moving workload to the cloud, so the cloud is growing. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And cloud providers cannot grow if they run out of data center space. So whereas enterprise moves or expansions of data centers tend to come from equipment refreshes or disaster recovery plans, things that are maybe perhaps less time sensitive or that can be put off slightly, for cloud providers, they often just cannot grow if they run out of data center space. And cloud providers will often lease data center space when entering new markets, when it's difficult to get land or permits to build. And cloud providers also will continue to build, operate data centers themselves, but typically in areas where costs are low and where they can do that on a slightly longer time horizon. So we actually have we keep our own hyperscale database for space that is owned with some records of space that cloud providers lease. And we also have a team that tracks different, reasons that go into why a cloud provider would put space in one location versus another. So following state incentives, we look at those. We track, and we'll talk in a little bit about energy efficiency locations or where power is generated. So all of those go into determining where cloud providers have their own space. But of course, also latency is a big factor, and how close they need to be to big network locations, as well as population centers. So the cloud team publishes Market Monitor, which tracks revenue growth for cloud providers. And breaks that down into all kinds of categories. But certainly, no matter how you look at it, cloud is continuing to grow. In North America by about 15%, but worldwide, enormously. And cloud providers will continue to need more data center space. So both in the locations where they're currently settled and in new locations, we'll see a lot more demand for cloud space going forward.
And I think, to tag on with that, what's interesting about this to me is, we see the cloud providers actually leveraging colo facilities as a growth strategy, right? So as you pointed out already, they build their own data centers where it's cheap to do it, and then where it's either more expensive or just challenging, like downtown LA or downtown New York City. It's kind of hard to build in those areas just because real estate is so expensive, but there's already colo providers that have space there, so they'll take advantage of them. And so you see this sort of pattern of how cloud providers are using it. Interestingly, though, like as we've seen just in the past 6 months, data center providers are seemingly shifting focus totally towards the hyperscalers, right? Like that's all they want to talk about, and they're hoping to gather that revenue, obviously. But it's important to realize and understand that this is part of a growth strategy. It's not a shift for them. For them, they're going to leverage all of these, right?
Right. Excellent point. And for example, we've looked at where this could be when it comes to certain countries. So, for example, cloud providers, when we calculate internally the amount of revenue growth expected in Canada, considering that some of the uptake for public cloud there has been a little bit delayed compared to uptake by enterprises in the U.S., and then also looking at the amount of space that already exists from cloud providers or belonging to them in Canada, it's definitely a lot less than we would expect. So we could imagine that there would be maybe as much as 20 megawatts a year demand for additional cloud space in somewhere like Canada. And we'll be looking at this around the world, but also hopefully in a little bit more specifics for particular locations.
So I think, as part of this conversation, we've heard about for years the cloud growing, right? We've heard that it seems to be almost growing uninhibited. For a while, there was a conversation around, well, is it just going to be Amazon or is it just going to be Microsoft? Like, who's going to win this war, right? The reality is, like, if we take a step back and ask the question, why? Why is cloud growing so much? And can we expect it to continue to do so? The answer is this. The answer is that we are living in a multi-cloud world that could also be hybrid. And that's what's driving all this growth. So it's not just Amazon. It's not just Microsoft. It's everybody's growing. And so you have the situation where it's like a rising tides lifts all ships scenario. So I may, as a company, have a need to put things in Amazon. I may have a need to put things in a colo provider that offers me a private cloud solution. And then I may have also a need to put things on site. And there's either some collaboration between these environments or not, right? So it could be the thing. So what we're getting at here is there simply is no one ring to rule them all, so to speak. So we're taking advantage of pieces and parts kind of here and everywhere. And as I said, it's a multi-cloud world. And what I mean by that, if we can just kind of backpedal for just 1 second. So we delineate hybrid from multi-cloud. Multi-cloud is I have one workload that lives in the public cloud, and I have another workload that's totally separate that runs on my premises. And when I say totally separate, I mean like they don't need to talk to each other. Maybe there's some backups or something like that happening, but like one is not dependent on the other. Hybrid, on the other hand, they are dependent on each other. And so you see companies, though, doing all of this. And that's, I think, what's fascinating. And perhaps, you could take a look at it, and our research shows that people just sort of end up there by accident, right? Mm-hmm. They have a net new application. They stick it in the cloud. That works great. Let's not mess with it. Let's leave it alone. And so this is how the cloud is growing. And interestingly, so if we move to the next slide, we see a change coming, right? There's a tip in the balance of what's coming, and that is workloads are moving off-prem. We've been talking about and hearing about this for quite some time. Well, it's happening. And I've noticed in our slide we're sort of missing a key point here. You'll notice, so on the left-hand diagram, the dark blue is currently, the light blue is in 2 years. So that's what we're saying here. So today, the majority of IT for companies sits in a company-owned data center. That's 60% of businesses. And in 2 years, they believe that it will be 40% of their workload will be on-premise. Same thing. And so, where is that going? Well, it's a mixed bag, as we said already, and it's off-premises cloud, and it could be third-party co-location. So there's lots of interesting things that's kind of going on there. And if you kind of look, so there's an interesting sort of side conversation to this, if you will. Over the last couple of years, we've spent a lot of time talking about multi-tenant data center providers offering things beyond co-location, so things like cloud, things like managed services. Interestingly, so if you take a look at the diagram on the right, on the same slide, you'll see what services am I purchasing or considering purchasing from a colo provider. And if you look at almost everything there, it's like classic colo, right? It's cages, it's racks, it's smart hands. And if you look down towards the very bottom, we've got cloud services, whether it be IaaS, PaaS, or whatever. And I can tell you just sort of anecdotally, having worked for a managed service provider, when we looked at our data center provider, we didn't think of them as a cloud provider. We thought of them as a data center provider. So you had this bit of a perception issue, and we see the industry still sort of wrestling with this. So companies may have their cloud environments with a colo provider, or it may just be, like a dedicated cloud provider that does private clouds on site, or they can do it for you in someone else's data center, things like this. So anyway, this is an interesting side conversation.
Although I think it'll be interesting in that aspect, the connectivity to the public cloud,
Yep.
and the more that that's routed through data center providers, I think especially for smaller companies, that may change that perception.
Yeah, and actually that's a wonderful segue to the next slide when we talk about what are the use cases for hybrid cloud. Like, why are people even doing this? And you brought up an excellent conversation, which is sort of this burstability. Like, if my data center has connectivity, direct connectivity into a public cloud provider, I can leverage them for workloads that need to dynamically expand, right? And so we asked the question, what best describes hybrid or multi-cloud strategy for you? And these are sort of the responses that we got. Interesting. So what we've done here, so we've kind of put boxes around the ones that we see companies pairing. So it may not be that you just leverage one of these. You may take several of these and kind of combine them together. The example on the screen here is, so I have on-premises resources for existing workloads. Think of that as legacy workloads. And then I have IaaS or public cloud for offsite and disaster recovery. So maybe, my disaster recovery, if my building, burns down, I want to be able to restore to the cloud. That's totally an option these days. And then finally, the last piece there is I want to be able to burst to public cloud. So say I'm a retail provider, and around Christmas, my web servers just can't handle the retail traffic and the e-commerce that's going on. So I want to be able to burst to the cloud to kind of handle that extra, heavy lifting. So this is an option as well. All right, well, let's move on to the next section, so IoT. So if you're playing along with buzzword bingo, here's your number one, IoT, right? Like, this is the most popular conversation these days. Let me go ahead and say number two, which is Edge.
Yeah. We got cloud in there.
We got cloud in there.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, so we're up to number three. So if you're playing along, hopefully no one's drinking at this hour of the day. But anyway, so IoT, so let's talk about this. So super popular conversation among data center providers today, and everybody's thinking, how will IoT affect us, and will it affect us, and is there a workload, that's important? Part of what's driving that, so if we move on to the next slide, so this is, okay, here's buzzword bingo number 4, the classic engine example, the jet engine example, right? So this is what has everyone's interest peaked. So just using this as a singular example, like we're not talking about, although it is involved, thermostats, like it's not smart refrigerators, it's things like this, the jet engine, the classic jet engine scenario. So just as a quick example, GE, their new jet engines develop about a half a petabyte of data per flight. So if you think about an airplane that has 4 engines, that's 2 petabytes of data per flight. Multiply that by, some 20,000 odd flights just in the U.S. alone. That is a ton of data. Like, I'm bad at math. I'm not even going to try to figure out what that equals. It's a lot, right? And so we have to think about, what do we do with all this data? What does GE want to do with this? What does American Airlines or Delta, what do they want to do with it? And where are they going to do something with it? And we'll get into the where and why here in just a second, but this is really what's kind of driving the thought and the conversation. When we think about all this IoT data, the very first thing that should come to mind is analytics. IoT is all about analytics. We're generating a lot of data. What can I learn from that? How can I develop my business? How can I further my business? Is there anything that we can learn? So let's just kind of walk this airplane engine forward and kind of think through it. What happens? So we see multiple analyses of this data. So first, we have a real-time analysis, and this is for the pilots. So say, we're flying through the air, something is going wrong with the engine, it sends a notification to the pilot. The pilot needs to make a real-time decision. Do I land the plane, or is it okay? I can continue on my journey. When I land, I just need to let the ground crew know. So that's example number 1. Now, if you're thinking about that, obviously, we have no time for latency, right? Like, if there is something wrong with the airplane engine, we need to know it immediately. We need to act on it potentially immediately. So we have no room for latency. Now, pass number 2, let's say, we want to take all this data that the engines are generating and say, okay, generally what we're seeing, I'm just throwing numbers out here, is after 2,000 hours of use, we have to do this part or this bit of maintenance on my engines. So what if we started doing that maintenance at 1,500 hours instead of waiting until 2,000 hours when it's mandatory? What if we did it early? That allows our planes to stay in the air longer. It keeps our costs down because we're not having to shuffle people around for missed flights, things like this. And then yet another pass at this data could be this. So in our fleet of airplanes, we have X number of this particular engine. What trends am I seeing across all those engines? Is it, instead of 2,000 hours or instead of 1,500 hours, I need to be doing this at 1,300 hours because of a trend I'm seeing across all my planes and my fleet. So these are kind of the interesting things, but as you're listening to that, you can hear that these different points of analysis can happen at different places, right? So the first one, that needs to happen on the airplane or in the engine itself, right? Like these are real-time things. The other ones, though, maybe that can happen later today, or maybe that can happen next week or next month. So that data itself can reside just about anywhere, right? And so that is what we're seeing as this data is moving on. So if we move to the kind of the next slide here, we can talk about, so what are those decision points? What do we care about? So number one is latency, and we talked about this already, right? Latency between the engine and the pilot, like that needs to be immediate. So we don't have time to send that data to the ground, let somebody analyze it, send it back to the pilot. Like we've got a problem that needs to be addressed, which is the second one, which is data criticality. Is the data that's being generated, or are the decisions that I'm needing to make, are they absolutely critical or just sort of critical, or it's kind of a nice to have? And then the last thing is data volume. And of course, again, the airplane engine is the perfect example because we have this object flying through the air. We don't have bandwidth available to send down 2 petabytes of data, so we need to be able to make some processing and think about it like that. And so, data center providers are beginning to think about, well, what if I position my data center near an airport that's in a non-NFL city, but it's a pretty major airport? Could an airline ship that data to my data center and do processing there locally, and that kind of speeds up at least some of the workflow? These are the things that we're kind of thinking about, and realistically, that's kind of what's driving this conversation around IoT. So continuing on the conversation, and on the next slide, where is all this data initially being stored? And I had to point out on this slide, there's a bit of a teaser. So if you just go straight to the top of the graph, you're going to see within public cloud. However, we sliced this pie pretty thin, and almost around 37%, if you add up some of those lower ones, that's actually happening. That data is being stored right next to call it like literally next to the device that's generating the data. So if you just kind of glance at this slide, it's going to give you a little bit of a skewed result. But this gives us a feel, right? So we can say a lot of it happens next to the device. Some of it can then happen in the public cloud. Some of it happens on-prem. And so all of this is generating data and the possibility for growth if I'm a data center provider. So the interesting thing about this, go ahead, you were going to say something?
Oh, yeah, I was going to jump in that one of the big questions, of course, is in our surveys, we ask people where they're planning on storing and processing data in the future, and a lot of enterprises answer that they're storing or processing that data currently at their own data centers, but that in 2 years they plan to use cloud.
Right.
And so the big question is where the network falls in this, and whether the network will be, whether there will be enough bandwidth for all of these expected moves to cloud, especially when it comes to latency considerations.
Yeah, and interestingly, so we've talked to data center providers and asked them, what are you doing for IoT? Are you doing anything for IoT? And by and large, most of them will yield that it's just kind of a fun and interesting conversation for today, and there's nothing that they can tell is happening. However, what they are seeing is that companies which are customers of theirs are growing, and those companies are leveraging IoT in some interesting way. So it may be, if you're a data center provider, it may not be that you directly know that IoT is influencing growth, but it is causing your customers to grow. And so that's how we're seeing it play out today, and that does kind of make it tricky for us in a very tangible way to say, Digital Realty is growing by X, Equinix is growing by Y, and we can kind of dive into the different providers. It makes it hard because they themselves oftentimes don't know. Which brings us to the next slide and an interesting conversation around edge. So what is edge? You hear people talking about positioning things. We've taken a swing at it here with this slide. I will also offer that we're currently working to change this definition because we want this to be broadly applicable and not just specific to an industry. So as it is today, where you have constraints on resources, that is where edge is. So if you're a data center provider and you don't have data centers in non-NFL cities, your edge is going to be an NFL city. If I am Boeing, my edge is probably at the engine or in the plane, right? So this edge is kind of moving. But as it is today, how we've defined it, so we have edge, near edge, and core. And there's a potential for data centers to be needed at any one of these locations, right? Because processing happens at any one of these locations. Now you may say to me, Dan, Kelly, how are we going to put a data center on an airplane? Well, a data center might look like a little box, right? This may be compute. It may not actually be a data center as we think of it today. And quite realistically, that's how it happens today, right? Like Boeing has been doing this forever. GE has been doing this forever. And so this is sort of where it's going. But it at least causes us to ask the question, where next? If I'm a data center provider, I'm thinking, is it Kansas? Is it, Reno? Is it, some destination that there's a decent population there, but there's also an interesting airport there, or there's an interesting manufacturing company there. Lots of things to think about here, and it really comes down to who you're targeting and where are their resources constrained. Yeah. So moving on.
Exactly. And speaking of resource constraints, the next trend that we'll be looking at certainly is efficiency and sustainability, and particularly the sourcing of energy and what that's going to mean going forward. It's becoming a much bigger conversation than we've seen in the past. So according to a 2016 report by the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratories, which had been commissioned by the U.S. Department of Energy, it's been estimated that data centers back in around 2014 already accounted for almost 2% of all the electricity consumed in the U.S. And there was some discussion back then about perhaps cloud and multi-tenant data centers offsetting and becoming more efficient and offsetting some of the inefficiencies in enterprise data centers. But as far as we kind of calculate at 451, we don't think that's exactly happening. So what we're seeing is that cloud and multi-tenant data centers are growing. The enterprise data centers are shrinking, but not perhaps quite as much. We have the complication of the energy efficiency gains in servers not necessarily proceeding as quickly as they have been. Some of the chip manufacturing continues to improve, but at a less rapid rate. And some of the efficiency gains from virtualization are tapering off. So as a result, 451 Research thinks that available IT power is going to increase by about 50% going forward. And all of that comes to play when we're talking about renewable energy options. So folks are starting to think more and more, and certainly as we centralize data center resources and cloud providers become bigger and the amount of data center space they require becomes bigger, they do start to become very visible, and there starts to be a lot more sort of conversations around where their power is coming from, what power that each data center is using. There's been a lot more questioning about, for example, generators, whether they pollute things, how much noise pollution there is from them. So there are a lot more conversations around just the energy usage by a data center in general.
I think, kind of an interesting part of this conversation in the past, there's several tech companies out there like Apple, for example, or like Google, who really put forward in their corporate message that they care about the environment, they want to be green, they've committed to 100% renewable energy resources by some year in the future. And what has been fascinating to me anyway is when you talk to data center providers, they will say, yeah, they care about that, but only until it starts really costing them a lot. And then what they would do is they would buy data center space in, like a coal energy provided data center, and then they would do something to offset that carbon somewhere else, right, by like doing carbon credits or, things that we all argue about. Does that even make a difference? But the change that we've seen, though, is that, like, people are starting to ask for this, right? I mean, like, beyond ask for this, like, they're moving towards this. So we recently saw Google is buying like 400 and some odd megawatts of solar-generated power in Tennessee and Alabama. And interestingly, they're using Alabama to power their Georgia data center. So you see these interesting moves, and people or companies rather are putting their money where their mouth is. And this is sort of where the rubber meets the road. Is they're saying, okay, we've done all we can do with carbon, credits and whatever. Like, we have to start actually generating energy and kind of making a difference with our consumption. So that's kind of, like I would offer that this is a conversation that we've been hearing for years, and now we're seeing action.
Yep, and another aspect of this as well is we're talking to a lot more data center providers that are concerned about water as well.
Yep.
So it's not just power source and how efficient things are, but also where the water is coming from and how scarce that water could be in the future. We're starting to see data centers with enormous cisterns, for example, below
yep.
them that are gathering rainwater. So just a lot more interest in how the data center as a whole, how efficient and sustainable that is. And it's not just us imagining this. So in Uptime surveys data center operators every year, and in the past year they asked questions about on-site renewable power and purchasing from utilities. And interestingly, over 12% of the respondents have actually installed on-site renewable power, and 20% more are considering it. So that's quite a lot, and definitely different from previous years. And nearly 20% have purchased renewable power from utilities. So getting back to the discussion of where, for example, key large data centers are going to be, we may start to see renewable power options from utilities driving some of those data center location decisions as well. We have certainly seen that from the big cloud providers, but it may kind of continue to sort of spread out, and we may see even more enterprises looking at that as an advantage for where the location of the data center is.
I think, to tie on with this, we've had a comment in the Q&A section. By the way, if you've got questions, feel free to go ahead and be asking those now. But one of our commenters has pointed out that we need to continue to think fundamentally about how to change the efficiency of the data center, and that has been kind of a long and kind of ongoing conversation. But you're absolutely right. Like, once we've generated, like, solar is not as easy to gather as it is a nuclear power plant or a coal-fired power plant. So you're absolutely right. We do need to continue to think about how can we drive efficiencies in the data center where we're cooling what needs to be cooled instead of this entire room, perhaps. Thinking along those lines, you're absolutely right. We still need to continue to think about that.
Yeah, and we have another whole trend in our preview report on cooling and where some of the trends are with cooling as well as density, right, and what that means for the efficiency of the data center and how to cool it more effectively, and kind of just the overall increase in efficiency that we need to see from these, as well as the source of the power. So then the other aspect of kind of the climate change question is really the increased severity of extreme weather events and just generally kind of risk planning. And up until now, of course, data centers have certainly focused on this, and where the data centers are located has been a big issue. But I think as we start to see increasingly common weather events that previously were only supposed to happen every 100 or 500 years. For data centers, on the one hand, that means they need to be extra prepared and perhaps, site the data center in a higher location or in a spot where they might not otherwise have worried before, but, now need to think about these things. But it also is a good chance for them to differentiate, right? And we saw this with Hurricane Sandy in New York, where you had a lot of Manhattan companies lose power because of the hurricane and realized that it might make more sense to put these things, to put their IT in a data center that did not lose power because it was built to withstand that kind of thing, or to look at cloud and maybe some of their backup options as well, and having their equipment or having their IT in multiple locations just to get around that. So I think we'll certainly start seeing more of that, and we'll be looking particularly at the kind of innovative ways that data centers are building. I know, Dan, you've looked at some data centers in Tokyo, for example.
Yeah. So I think part of the interesting thing about this conversation is we're just now starting to talk about this in the United States because of flooding and other things that you've mentioned. The Houston area comes to mind. some of the past hurricanes that we've seen come up the East Coast has sort of furthered this conversation. But in other parts of the world, they've been thinking and dealing with this for quite some time, right? So if we look at Tokyo, for example, the Japanese island chain is sort of known for earthquakes. And so data center providers there are differentiating themselves by building very earthquake-resistant buildings that basically float on top of these giant rubber discs so the whole building can move. It's really fascinating and interesting, and so that's what they've done. In Indonesia, they're thinking about building their data centers away from volcanic activity. And then in other places still, like in Hong Kong, they're thinking about building their data centers away from where the storm surge hits because they always get monsoons and typhoons. And so it's, all these other places in the world have been forced to think about this. And it's really what I think will be interesting to watch is in the future how data center providers in the United States begin to tailor their messages, as you've said already, to say, my data center, not only is it not in a 500-year floodplain, which, by the way, is now every 2 years, as you said, but it's up on this hill, and there's no way it's going to be affected by flooding, or things like that. Or it's far enough out of town that we're far enough away from the ocean that a tidal wave would never come this far, and it just couldn't possibly do that. So it'll be interesting because this is how the rest of the world communicates the differentiation with their data centers is where is it located, what's underneath it, what's nearby it. And we've just been fortunate in the United States that a lot of our metros don't have to think about this, but because of the changing climate and just the weather patterns and things like that, we do have to start thinking about this now. So it's a wonderful conversation. I think it's going to be interesting to watch in the next couple of years, which of course might be included in our preview.
Well, and it's also impacting the way data centers are built, right? With some in Manhattan, for example, putting generators and fuel pumps on the roof and things like that. So, there will be a lot there going forward. So that covers the trends we wanted to talk about so far this year, and we'll certainly be examining those and many more going forward. I wanted to just list an example sort of preview of some of the things we'll be covering in 2019. So we'll be looking at our usual market by market, either city or country by country market sizing reports with supply and demand and listing the providers in these various locations. We're adding a lot more coverage of Latin America this year, so we've got Argentina's report coming out, Brazil and Chile also do. We're hoping to perhaps add Mexico in there. We're also adding some coverage of South Africa and potentially Italy and some other markets in Europe, as well as continuing to cover Asia and both the largest top markets and emerging markets in North America. We also have an analyst devoted to interconnection, so we'll continue to work on that. And we've got continuing coverage of intriguing technologies, so all the new innovative technologies that data center providers are using, as well as disruptive technology that could impact them going forward. So with that, we'll take any questions. I think we've seen a list here.
Yeah. We've got quite a few things going on. It looks like several of you have been asking about wanting the slide deck and wanting the report for download, and I believe we've gotten those situated. So moving on to the questions just related to this topic, though, we've got an interesting one, and if you've got your buzzword bingo chart, pull that back out. You're going to need it in a second. So the question is, tell us about edge micro or regional data centers. What are those going to look like? Do we think blockchain is going to influence that at all? And do we see open compute actually affecting this at all? So let me kind of swing at this first, and I would love to hear your opinions as well. I would actually like to know what edge and regional data centers are going to look like because we just don't know yet. But there's been a lot of conversations around data centers at the base of cell towers, right? And like these micro modular type data centers. And you do see some of that happening, but it's not kind of like across the board. I think a few years ago people thought, oh, well, this is going to be like this grand, there'll be like little data center boxes kind of everywhere, right, and on the corner of every street in downtown New York. I don't see that happening, quite frankly, but there is going to be a need for it. And, kind of how I see this playing out, and Kelly, I'm interested to hear what you think, but the way I see this playing out is companies like Equinix, for example, buying up some small data center provider in Charleston, South Carolina, or in Greenville, South Carolina, where they have a data center already, they have an existing business, but Equinix or some large global provider sees a need to go into that area, and then they further expand it. So it looks more like data centers do today, just on a smaller scale. And I'm guessing, my bet is this happens through acquisition instead of an Equinix going in and building their own, in small town USA. It could happen. We'll see. But I kind of feel like acquisition is sort of the first mode. Let's start there, and we'll come back to blockchain in a second.
Sure, yeah. Well, I'll just add in that I think one of the challenges is the business model. So we have a big team that works on Internet of Things and we've got a lot of very detailed modeling going on to look at all the potential endpoints for the Internet of Things, how much data those are going to generate. We have another team looking at 5G and the kind of data that will also be needed there and where that data will need to sit. We are trying to put that all into a master model that will sort of spit out where some additional data center space will be needed. But of course, it's pretty hard to tell. And I think the challenge there is it seems pretty clear that a lot more data center space will be needed pretty much everywhere, from both local, very, very close cell tower type endpoints, but also for these central cloud, processing sites. The trick is knowing exactly how much, and then the business model of who's going to pay for it. So in the past, that would be the perfect thing for a telco to pay for. They were the ones who often, paid for that kind of very granular infrastructure in a lot of locations. Going forward, it's unclear, how much appetite telecom providers have for that. Mobile providers are busy, paying for the 5G equipment themselves and may not have extra budget for the data center space to store all that data. But, I think as the problem increases or as the need for processing and storage in all these locations grows, then, there'll be some really interesting business models emerging to see who's going to pay for that.
Yeah, and I think, to kind of link onto that with open compute. Open compute is something that we've been hearing about for a little while now, and I love the initiative, right? I love the idea of open source, whether it be for the compute platform, whether it be for the data center platform itself. And what we've yet to see, though, is like the whole industry sort of gel around one of these ideas. And I think that has to happen before we really see any major influence from it into the data centers. This is how this plays out today, right? You have a company like Google, who is very much invested in open compute. They come into a multi-tenant data center provider. They don't want you to do anything. They don't want their room fitted out with what you think fits for open compute. They don't want your ACs built around what you think works for their open compute. They want a blank canvas, right? They want to come in and do what they want to do, and then they put their stuff in there. So they, like the way these big guys, like the cloud players that are using open compute are handling this today, they really just sort of want you to get out of the way. Let me do it, I'll take care of it. However, I think, this is my gut, I think if we as an industry, as a data center industry, could sort of gel around one of these ideas, that you would see more of this where Google and the others would be okay with handing off some of that because they know you're going to do it right and to their standards. So I think that sort of answers that part of the question. Now on to blockchain. So blockchain, I have yet to see anybody in the data center industry doing anything meaningful with blockchain. However, you may see things like in the healthcare industry. Healthcare, in my opinion, is the most, by and away, the most compelling non-cryptocurrency use of blockchain. And you may see some growth from healthcare providers, so like hospitals and whatnot, wanting to implement a blockchain solution for their patient records, for their medical diagnosis and things like that. And then that would cause some amount of growth. But what it's going to look like to data center providers is I just need more space to put more compute storage and whatever. And so I think that's how we as the data center industry will see this play out. As I said, I've yet to see any compelling ask or demand around, give me a blockchain solution. I could see it for like a ticketing scenario or something like. I mean, we could postulate about it, but we don't need to. But anyway, so that's kind of my thoughts on that. Another question. So what do we? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. No, I was just going to go to the question, sort of follow on from that on the integration of the data from these different edge markets. And certainly, yes, I think we're already seeing data center players become kind of the integrators or the location for a lot of the integration of the data that's coming from these more edge markets. So we're already seeing almost kind of back office type processing of IoT data or of, for example, 5G kind of content. A lot of that, I think, is already starting to sit in these more central and typically very network dense data centers. So I think you'll see continued demand for those for exactly that use case. Yes, as part of this.
And I think, tying on that, you mentioned 5G, but that was part of a question as well, is how do we see 5G playing into these edge data centers or just in general? And I think really, to start off with, as you've said, it's going to be these network dense data centers. It's going to be the carrier hotels, things like that, where we have lots of connectivity, lots of, a spider web, if you will, of network that reaches out so that we're able to communicate quickly and efficiently. So I think that's how it plays out initially. Obviously, there's going to be some space needed for all the 5G gear, just like we saw with, 4G and 3G, but it wasn't quite as dramatic. So we'll just have to wait and see how that plays out. Now, an interesting question that's come through, and I want to get to this, continuing with our edge conversation, is a commenter has made or a question, a listener has made the comment that when they look at edge market, integration seems to be the key. And will data center providers become integrators? And what's interesting is, like, we've seen that already, right? Like in other parts of the world, we've seen data center providers are managed service providers. They're also systems integrators. And so people can provide more than just a box sitting out in the field. I can provide you with services to manage it and things like that.
So not just from the edge angle, but also just managed services in general.
That's right. So that is a trend I could see very definitely moving its way to the edge.
Right. And then another question we've had here is, what do we expect to be the net growth for smaller colo markets? So are we in this phase where retail colocation in some of the sort of emerging or smaller cities starts to decline as their small local customers go straight to public cloud, maybe reduce their amount of colocation? And will new workloads move from on-prem to off-prem, but that doesn't make up for this loss? So what's happening in some of these smaller cities? Do you want to address that? I know you cover a lot of these.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I do cover a lot of smaller cities, and I've yet to see a decline. What I do see, though, is, going on with the conversation just 2 seconds ago, is that providers are offering more than just colo. And so they may themselves partner with Microsoft Azure. And so in a city, you may see Azure be super, super popular, and it's because there's a company in town that's an advocate. And they help companies get there, they help manage the environments, and then they also help deal with the things that are on-prem or maybe co-located in their own facilities. The key there is that they help, right? Like, these are companies in these areas, you see lots of smaller businesses, they just need help getting there. And quite frankly, they don't care if it goes to the public cloud. They don't care if it goes in a hybrid cloud or a dedicated private cloud. What they want is that it works and that you help them, because they don't have enough IT people to kind of manage that and offset their own, just the day-to-day stuff they have to do themselves. And so that's really what I see, is it's this move towards managed services, move towards cloud. I don't see a decline. Admittedly, though, these second-tier markets or third-tier markets, as the commenter has called them, they grow slow, right? I mean, like when we look at, Greenville, South Carolina, for example, like there are data centers there. That market grows really slowly, but it keeps up with the demand. There just happens to not be a ton of demand there.
Yeah, it's funny because I think people talk about edge and expect to see a lot of really rapid growth in these markets, but the rapid growth, Northern Virginia adding a data center that's 80 megawatts.
Right.
That growth is just going to be way beyond any growth you're going to see from Providence, right? But Providence is still cooking away and growing, and there's still demand there. It's just that when you get to these really edge markets, or even just distributed markets, right, you're going to see growth, but it's going to be on a much smaller scale.
Yeah.
So it may not hit the radar in the same way, but it's still out there, and some of these providers are doing just great.
I think that brings up actually a wonderful point. Like, I think everybody is standing around looking for the next Ashburn. Like, we're all like panning for gold. Like, where can I go buy real estate today that tomorrow is going to be worth like $5 billion because the data center provider wants to build there? And like, I hate to say this, but like, Ashburn is kind of a unique animal, right? And I think it's incorrect to assume that we'll ever see that growth necessarily in. And I keep going to Greenville. I don't know why it's on my mind, but like in Greenville, Greenville's never going to be Ashburn. Or Providence, Like they're never going to be Ashburn. But that doesn't mean that meaningful growth for that market can't happen. Right. And that companies like an Equinix or perhaps a Digital Realty or whomever might not one day be interested in acquiring a provider there because they see a use case for it. Because Amazon or Delta or GE or some company needs space in that market because it's close to something of interest. So just because you're not seeing, well, and admittedly, Ashburn only grows at, I think the last numbers I saw were like 8%, but that's 8% of a really massive market. Yes. So, but I mean, like literally, like we just got done looking at Argentina, there are data centers in Ashburn that are as large, like a single data center, are as large as the entire market of Argentina. Right. Like it's just weird. Yes. Like it's very
scale
unique.
Is so different.
Yeah, it's just different. It's just different.
Exactly. Let's see, other questions here. We had actually a question on the push back on company premises. So the fact that we're now seeing AWS and Microsoft start to offer options on-prem and what that could mean. Do you have any thoughts on that, Dan?
It's an interesting question. So we have seen data kind of moving around, and I think what this gets at is the fact that data is sort of fluid, right? When we tracked for a little while this idea of cloud repatriation, where companies rather would move data into the cloud or move workloads into the cloud, and then they would pull it back out. And then so we started seeing this as like a mini trend. It's perfectly feasible and logical to think that if I move something in a colo, I might not like the way it performs. I've seen this play out, right? So you have a manufacturing facility out in the middle of nowhere. A really slick sales guy comes through and says, hey, why don't you put your stuff in our data center? It'll work even better. It turns out there's not good connectivity between the manufacturing site and the data center site. So there is an awesome use case of when it doesn't make sense, right? So that data would very definitely pull back. Do I see this as a trend? I don't. I see people saying, I have this data center in my enterprise. I'm tired of messing with it. Like I'm at my 10-year refresh cycle or whatever the number is. I don't want to spend the millions of dollars to refresh all this stuff. So I'll move it to colo or I'll move it to cloud just so I don't have to deal with it anymore. Now, that's not universally true. Obviously, there's really big enterprises that, for whatever reason, want this in their wheelhouse. They want to have their arms around it. But I think more likely the case is that, we're seeing that companies are kind of moving away from on-prem, as we've shown in the research a minute ago. We're moving away from on-prem and kind of moving to either colo, cloud, or some mix of the above.
Right. I guess actually to follow on from that, we had another question on how well positioned the tier 2 data centers are to provide managed services. Are they in a good position? Do people, maybe that gets back to the original thing that you had mentioned during the webinar about whether people kind of envision them as managed service providers, right? Or just colo providers.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of the key is really, what services are you able to provide and how can you come alongside? I mean, I know this is a drum I pound on, quite regularly is that, it's all about coming alongside and providing value beyond just space, power, and cooling. Right. Like, how can I help you with your IT environment?
Yeah, and that follows through to actually another question that for those providers, are there certain services that are must-haves? What do customers expect from them now?
Ooh, that's a wonderful question. So in smaller cities, yes, absolutely. We see providers being very, very successful with things like dedicated private clouds, whether it's on-site or in my colo. I've seen colo providers who will stand up a private cloud at the customer's premise, and they manage that for them. As a service. So they're providing this as a service, and it's delivered pricing model-wise similar to what we see with the cloud guys. They will also offer managed services around the infrastructure that sits in their colo facility or at the customer premise. So there's lots of these. Like if you look at dedicated managed service providers, literally anything they do is open and fair game for colo providers. You just have to expand your way of thinking. And now here's the key pivot point, though. Colo providers are used to capital-intensive businesses. They're used to thinking about, I have to buy generators, I have to buy cooling units, and these are really expensive things. What they're not used to doing is hiring really expensive people. And managed services are people-intensive businesses, not capital-intensive businesses. So we have to we have to get beyond the thought of, I can run this facility with 5 people.
Right.
I actually need 25 people because they're doing managed services. So
very different business model.
Very different. Yes, that's right. That's right.
Interesting. Well, I think actually we may need to leave it there. We might have time for one more question. All right, we've got one more we could do. So we've had one about different levels of managed services.
Yeah, this is a question actually that's interesting, and we've answered this quite a few times in reports. So the question is, what are the different levels of managed services? We actually have a report series, so let me send you that in an email and follow up to this. But essentially the question is, are there levels? And what we've done in the report series is kind of dissected how valuable it is to the company that you're selling it to, how hard it is for you, the provider, to offer this service. This is a very long conversation, so let me answer that by saying I will email you the report series. You can check that out, and then we can definitely go from there.
He's got a whole list ranking them from, high value but high risk.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. How much of a pain in the rear it is, and things like this.
And what people really want. One thing, though, that I think is interesting is, in our tours, so we go out to a gazillion cities and we talk to all different kinds of providers, we are still hearing about local providers still having a certain advantage with local enterprises.
Yes.
And local enterprises do like knowing exactly where their stuff is. They like having the CEO's phone number. They like that personal touch that often they can get with a local provider that they don't get from one of the big national or multinational providers. So, despite maybe some worries about how those little guys do compared to the public clouds, a lot of them are still hanging in there and finding ways to be, valuable and useful to their customers, especially local customers, and there's just still demand for that.
Yeah, and I would like to point out, managed service, people forget the service.
Yeah.
Like, you're providing a service, and like a lot of times we hear just the phrase thrown around, white glove service. What's implied is that you're providing a very high level of service. It's like when you go to an expensive hotel, you expect certain things, right? When you buy managed services, your customers are expecting similar things. They want to know that when I call you, you're going to pick up the phone and answer, you're going to take care of my problem immediately. And like you said, it's not uncommon at all for me to talk to CEOs of small data center providers that offer managed services in small town USA, and they're like, I have 5 customers that are my top customers. They all have my direct cell phone number, and they have called me at 2 in the morning.
Yeah, exactly.
And customers, there are businesses that want that. Yeah. Now, it's probably not Philips or Magnavox, right? That's not the customer we're talking about. It's some small business in the middle of small town USA, but that's the level of service that and this can be very profitable. This can be a very profitable business. It just looks different than digital realty.
Right, or than the typical co-location.
Right, it's just different.
Yep. So with that, I think we'll wrap up our webinar. For those of you, there are a couple questions out here we didn't get to, and we will certainly answer you over email.
Yep.
You'll also be able to download the slides, and there will be a replay available. So with all of that, thank you very much for attending the webinar. We look forward to more conversations and webinars going forward throughout the year. And thank you again for attending.